Welcome to Tea with the Experts and Dr. Leah Merle, your premier destination for mental health insights, empowerment, and inspiration. Led by the passionate therapist and counselor educator, Dr. Leah Merle, this interview-style podcast delves deep into diverse themes with top-notch experts in the field. Beginning with the What Is series, from anxiety, trauma to resilience and mindfulness. We sip our way through captivating conversations, psychological insights, shedding light on the complexities of mental wellness and what it means to be a human being. Each episode serves up a refreshing blend of knowledge, empathy, and empowerment, aiming to destigmatize mental health issues and raise awareness in an engaging and approaching manner. So grab your favorite cuppa and get ready to step yourself into transformative conversations that will leave you feeling uplifted and enlightened. Subscribe now and join the movement to break down barriers and foster a more compassionate world.
Welcome back to Tea with the Experts and Dr. Leah Merle. This is the podcast where we explore the intersections of mental well-being, human resilience, and emotional growth. And today we're diving into part 3 of what is grief in an emotionally avoidant culture. So I'm joined once again by the incredible Dr. Dani Baker, who's a grief therapist and an educator. And she has really dedicated her career to helping individuals navigate profound loss with compassion and authenticity. So together, we're going to explore the concept of disenfranchised grief, which might be a new term to many of the listeners. We're also going to discuss real-world examples and highlight how society can better support those who feel unseen or unvalidated in their grieving process. So grab your cup of tea and join us for this meaningful conversation. Dr. Dani, thank you so much for being here again today. Thanks for joining me.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Dr. Leah Merle, for inviting me back a third time.
Yeah.
I know the first 2 times together, we covered a lot of territory. So how amazing for you to have me back to talk even more about a subject matter that is so near and dear to my heart. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, you're so welcome. And we did get some feedback as well. So obviously we've kind of recorded these 1 week apart. And so the first was published 1 week over the festive period, over the holidays in the United States of America. The second one is the week after. And then the third one is the week after that. So ultimately, I think that reviewing parts 1 and 2, Dani, would be really important. So obviously we laid the foundation by exploring the cultural dynamics that really contribute to emotional avoidance, especially around grief. And we talked about how Westernized cultures often prioritize this sense of moving on over processing emotions. And so the toll that can take on individuals who are grieving is specific. We also delved into the layers of grief and primary losses like the death of a loved one, secondary losses such as the loss of identity or routines that maybe often follow. Meaning making and continuing bonds as well were really 2 key concepts that we touched on, helping us understand how grief evolves and then how we can navigate it with compassion as well. So for those who are just joining us in this episode specifically, I really encourage you to check out parts 1 and 2 for a deeper understanding of these foundational ideas, because this episode, the third and final episode, really builds on those earlier 2. So I'm really, really excited to continue this journey as we explore disenfranchised grief, a topic that really needs more awareness and understanding. And we've talked about that many times before, Dani. So let's start with a quick overview from your perspective, Dani. Let's get right on to it.
Great. I'd love to. And you just did a beautiful job really touching on the overarching themes and subject matter that we talked about in parts 1 and 2. So I'm going to try to keep it as succinct and quick as you did as well, highlighting a few things such as misconceptions that are tied to natural healthy grief,
Yeah.
and grieving, such as grief does not occur as a linear or staged process. Rather, it is a fluid process that moves back and forth along a continuum or in and out of time frames that create adaptation and integration. We also touched on how grief after significant loss is not a one-dimensional experience. As you just highlighted, we often have our primary loss event, and then there are subsequent secondary and tertiary losses and beyond, really, connected to that primary loss. One other thing that we covered, which can tend to be a little controversial in the world of loss and grief, is that because grieving is so complex and the process of integrating multiple losses can take approximately 14 to 18 months of healthy processing and loss adaptation. This is said with the caveat that for some people, their healthy grieving and adapting and integrating significant loss time frame could be less or it could be more than that. This 14 to 18-month window is an average time frame based on my lived experience as a griever and my time working with many, many grieving individuals, families, and communities.
Yeah, no, I hear you, Dani. So ultimately, I mean, what you're saying is that grief after significant loss is both multi-layered and multifaceted, multi-layered, and a fluid process of really acknowledging the primary and secondary or tertiary losses while simultaneously moving forward and backward along a continuum, which I love that thought process. Or maybe even in and out of windows over time, over an extended period of time, so that the brain and the body can grieve, change, and integrate the losses they move forward in their life. And ultimately, in an effort to give that individual or yourself space that you need to find healthy ways, right? Healthy ways, adaptive ways to process and integrate loss. The time frame for each griever is different. It can be completely different for each individual.
Yes, well said and spot on.
Yeah.
You can see why healthy grieving takes quite a bit of time and significant psychosocial, cultural energy, significant energy, to not just adapt to the complexity of loss and multiple losses, but also begin to see who we are becoming through this highly transformative experience.
Yeah, thank you, Dani, for stating that. And there's so many things in this conversation that we've had that really stands out to me in everything that you've shared so far. But it's really the one, if I could kind of name the one thing, it's the importance of recognizing grief as a deeply personal and dynamic process. So there's no one size fits all approach. And I think you and I know in this field, sometimes people are wanting a more one size or more manualized model. So for many of us, really the concept of like, I think about a time heals all wounds kind of oversimplifies what is truly a multidimensional and evolving journey. So it's that individual experience. And then the other piece to that is I find so profound about this is that healthy grieving doesn't just adapt to loss, it transforms us, right, in the process. It's like you've mentioned that many times, is that transformation. And it really allows us to kind of reimagine our identity and our future in the midst of that pain. So it's not about getting over it, right? It's about moving through it potentially and learning to carry that loss in a way that aligns with who we are and who we're becoming because of the loss, right?
Yeah. I mean, again, well said. And what I'm really appreciating about what you're saying, this recap here, is It's so important to remember that when we experience significant loss, there's no doubt that we will be profoundly changed by that experience.
Yes.
One of the things that I know can happen, and rightfully so, is that through that process, as we start to change, as we start to adapt, as we start to transform over a significant period of time while we're grieving, there is huge fear, and rightfully so, that whatever it is that we are grieving, that we will be leaving behind,
Yeah.
that we are forgetting about something that is so, so dear and important to us. And the thing that's so important to remember is that while this is a lengthy process of moving back and forth in an effort to integrate and to learn new ways to adapt to who we're becoming through this process, the aspect of meaning making and the aspect of continuing bonds, which we talked about in our last, in part 2 of this series, is that is the part that doesn't change. So what I mean by that is we bring our people, our things, our animals, our experiences, whatever is so important to us that we may have lost in its original form.
Yeah.
We still bring everything that those people, animal, places, things, experiences mean to us. We bring it with us as we move forward. And so that's the other thing too, is that languaging is so important when we, not just when we communicate with folks, but also how we learn about what natural healthy grief looks like. And that there are a lot of steps forward and a lot of steps back. And in those steps back, it often feels as if we have lost ground, how we have lost all the hard work that we've been doing. And in reality, as I pointed out in part 2, we really need that in order for our brain and then eventually our body, our nervous system to integrate. So the taking steps forward and the taking steps back, so important. And in that process, what remains consistent is the continued bond that we have with whatever it is that we're grieving. And I think it's so important to remember that piece because oftentimes in westernized societies, it's about you need to be done with this process and move on. And move on implies as if A, we're never going to have a hard feeling again, and B, that whatever is so precious to us, we are leaving behind.
Yes.
And I think, and I don't think, I say this a lot. I think I said this in part 1, 2, and now 3. I think, no, not I think, I know that if you can find a way, if any of us can find a way to believe that we stay connected in those ways to our persons, places, things, animals, identities, any other thing that's relevant and important and precious to us, that it's not exactly the same and it is still a connection and a bond that comes with us as we determine and figure out who we're becoming through this process. So I think it's just so important to highlight that piece because part of what is covertly wrapped up in what I just said is hope. And when we are struggling in our lives, and that struggle is so real. And I talked about the water line in part 1, where this water line is just below our nose and we dip under that water line and we're, in the process of feeling like we're almost going to drown. And then we use our resources and get that water line back down again so we can breathe. It can sometimes feels like there's no hope when we're in those darkest days. And one of the things that, even if it doesn't feel like it now, planting that seed of staying connected does create a small element of hope. And so remembering, staying connected, it's in the remembering where we do our work, as well as finding some semblance of hope, even if it's the smallest shred. Those two things together are really a magical process and component a magical elixir that helps us to get through profound sorrow.
Yeah.
So, that said, by this time in our journey, especially together over the last three parts of the series of what is grief and emotionally avoidant culture, I think we can agree, hopefully, that it's a given that we all will experience some aspect of significant loss over our lifetime.
Agreed.
Thank you for that. And it's so important to continue to highlight that in Western societies, it's common to minimize the related biopsychosocial cultural impact loss has on many, many, many people. Often these losses can be categorized as a sudden loss, an expected loss, gradual loss, multiple losses over time to eventually a larger loss, ambiguous loss, where things are happening, but they're not really, maybe people are not present, but we are still in relationship with them, but they're not able to be in relationship with us due to other circumstances. Obscured loss, things that get covered up due to other things that are more important to survive while we're trying to navigate our grief. And then stigmatized loss. So many things I can think about in terms of stigmatized loss. I know I've already said a lot here. I'm just wondering, is there anything that comes up for you when we talk about stigmatized loss?
I think about over the past previous couple of years, I think about COVID-19, right? The pandemic that we all experienced globally. So I would say that is not in any particular order, but that's on there. A lot of the work that I've done within grief circles is traumatic loss and loss to suicide as well. I think that can be extremely stigmatizing.
Absolutely.
What else? Maybe in some ways the loss that's the death of a loved one that's maybe not blood related, right? That there's not a biological component there, but there's a relational component. In our United States of America, I think about gun violence. I won't go into that in too much detail, but that's prevalent. Loss related to infertility, postpartum, perinatal period, infant death, miscarriage. Then I think about other global issues like loss due to war, in war-torn societies. I think about my own loss that I've been through, loss of a pet. When I lost my my dog CK, loss of a pet. I think about people that I've worked with, from a medical perspective, people who have lost limbs, or the loss of a body part. So, the list goes on, right? We could add even more to that, but just to kind of, in the essence of being as concise as possible, I would say that's a good start. And again, in no particular order.
Yeah. So many aspects of identities and positionality in our world in general, on how people identify are stigmatized. So many things. And so as a result, the flip side of that is something being stigmatized about who we are or how we're represented, that then also is tied to some aspect of loss, not being able to be our authentic selves. And so each one of these types of losses that I just highlighted, and then Dr. Leah Merle went through in greater detail, each of these types of losses, whether they are ambiguous, obscured, sudden, expected, gradual, all put together, can often fall into what is called an encompassing category of disenfranchised grief. An all-encompassing category is what I really wanted to say.
Yes.
So, yeah, right? All of those things we could put into disenfranchised grief and many, many, many more things. Again,
Yeah.
that was not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. So, disenfranchised grief in an emotionally avoidant and grief illiterate culture is grief that is not openly acknowledged, socially accepted, or publicly mourned.
Yeah.
So you can see how all those things you listed for sure, right? And so when that happens, when these things cannot be openly acknowledged because it's not safe to do that for some folks, or is not socially accepted because it means then you are not seen as productive in a hegemonic, culture, or can't be publicly mourned because it's not part of what is considered, the standard form of mourning rituals. All of these things can be dismissive or hurtful. And what I mean by that is when not just not being accepted, but when people make comments about that, they're not taking into consideration individual or groups with different intersections of identity and positionality in society. This can look like a lack of sympathy or compassion for others' pain and suffering.
Yes.
This can look like exclusion from mourning rituals, as I pointed out earlier, or outward ways of acknowledging loss and profound sorrow. And this inability to acknowledge or believe, something I really highlighted a lot in part 1, believing people in their suffering, this inability to do that can lead to feelings of isolation, difficulty acknowledging and coping with significant primary and subsequent losses, and challenge the ability to adapt and integrate loss in healthy or brave ways of processing grief. And as I just described disenfranchised loss, it reminds me again of the list of the things that you highlighted: COVID-19 and the pandemic, loss related to suicide. I think you touched on gun violence, infertility, perinatal, postpartum miscarriage and infant death, losses due to wars, loss of the ability to physically function, whether it's an actual loss of a body part or just the ability for all aspects of our brains and bodies to work. One that we didn't cover was loss related to the death of a loved one who's not related to us in some way. That one is really, really tough, really tough. So when I think about just those things, it's such a powerful list, such a powerful list. And that's not all of the disenfranchised losses. That's just a few.
Yes.
We could go on and on and on. And so while these are excellent examples of significant loss events that are beyond overwhelming and so, so very painful to go through, it becomes even harder for folks who are experiencing this type of loss, this disenfranchised loss, when oppressive and invalidating aspects of what we would call, not acknowledging people's suffering and their pain, and the grief that is associated with that. It just makes it so much harder to navigate unbearable sorrow.
Yes.
Because that's really what I'm trying to say. The
Yeah.
point I'm really trying to get to. It is unbearable.
Mm.
So I'm curious, you did a great job giving us and the listeners a list of disenfranchised losses. Is there a specific population on the list that you've had an opportunity to work with? And if so, what were the common themes of disenfranchisement as it pertained to their lived experience and I would imagine, very complex loss issues they were navigating during that time?
Yeah, I know that's a really great question. I'm happy to share, of course. I think one of the big pieces in my experience is the disenfranchised loss of suicide loss. So typically, loss to suicide is a traumatic loss, and it is sudden, right? So it's not potential, it's not expected. And so I've worked a lot in grief circles as a drama therapist, working with survivors of suicide, and that group. The themes I would say that come out are sometimes not feeling comfortable in certain circles to be able to share that the person who died by suicide.
Yeah.
Because of the stigma associated with suicide within society, the connotations that come with that. the language that people use around that, the judgmental views that people have regarding folks who die by suicide. And so that one is huge. I would say that that's really significant. The other population I would say that I've had the opportunity and the experience of working with is folks and families or couples, dyads who have had some sort of death loss regarding miscarriage. And I know you know my story. I've been through that individually, and that is one of the reasons that I actually decide to work with this population of individual. And themes that I would say would be that people feel as if they feel judged sometimes by other folks regarding, well, it's not really a loss. It's not really a death loss because the baby's 12 weeks to 16 weeks old. It's not a human yet, right? It's not a baby yet. And that is really, really crushing to hear as an individual who has experienced that loss. Really devastating. There's some other kind of things that I've heard through clients that I've worked with. People say to individuals who have had a loss by miscarriage, if they have another child, and I've mentioned this before in one of the other episodes, is, well, at least you can get pregnant. You can get pregnant. And why that is something that sounds, okay, yes, that's positive. That's the hope for somebody to hang on to. It's not helpful in that moment of grief when the person is grieving that unborn child that they have visions and hope of birthing and raising, right? And so people really say inappropriate things sometimes. And so that's definitely with disenfranchised loss. That's one of the themes that I see is the inappropriateness or maybe the subconscious judgment that people share with folks who have experienced that loss. Not intentionally, it's subconscious. So, yeah, so that's my contribution there. What about you, Dani? Obviously, this a significant experience that you've had over 20 years of working with this population. What about you working with folks on this list that we've mentioned in today's episode?
Yeah. Well, yeah, lots and lots of people that I've worked with that have experienced, either big elements of disenfranchised grief or medium to smaller experiences. And in any case, it's really difficult for people that don't feel seen and validated in their lived experience. And I could say that there have been a lot prior to the pandemic. And I can say that working with people impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic was so, so complicated. So many of us at that time were living in a world of ambiguity when the pandemic hit, which created so much confusion and fear. And what I witnessed for many people who had loved ones that died during this time was an inability to share the truth about how they died. In a culture that already struggles so much to acknowledge significant losses, especially around death and the grief associated with them, this added an element of not being able to share the truth about their loved one's death was just so, so difficult and painful, as well as feeling unable to fully grieve their loved ones for fear of being judged or ostracized because it was so widely publicized. There was such a huge divide in what people's belief processes were during that time. And, I really believe in working hard to hold multiple truths. And so I can see how, at least this was my lived experience at the time. I remember thinking, yeah, people, again, so scared of this unknown thing that is killing people. But then stigmatized by a variety of things that were tied to people's intersections of identities, people's belief systems. And that's not an unusual thing just in life as it is. However, when you have folks who are dying, oftentimes having to die alone, your loved ones that you don't ever get to see, the level of disenfranchisement for those people who couldn't even tell the truth about how their person died, let alone the fact that they might have experienced this in a way where they couldn't even be with their people. I did not have that experience, and yet I cannot imagine how horrible that must have been. And I also wonder this many years out since those that beginning months of the pandemic, that first year or so, I just wonder where folks are at in their grieving process. This element that has been so disenfranchised, have they been able to find the space, find a brave space, a safe space where they can actually process what their lived experience was like?
Well, yeah, found. And many people went through what you're talking about, right? It's etched in my mind, March 2020, right? We all experienced from there.
Yeah, so hard. So when I think about this, I think about, well, what can we do? What can we do to better acknowledge and support people who are experiencing disenfranchised grief that may occur daily for many, many folks with different aspects of how they identify or their position in North American cultures? And when I think about that, thinking about us talking about this for the third installment of the series, it made me I was leaning back into what I've learned. And I've noted this in the last two parts of the series that I have learned so much from the gracious grievers that I have worked with over the years. And the experience they have had around feeling dismissed about their grief or the lack of awareness regarding their suffering or an inability to hold multiple truths, that who we are informs the way in which we grieve and honor our losses. So these are some of the things that in my research I found, both in anecdotally what I know has been helpful for folks, but also what I know is out there in terms of resourcing and supports for folks. So one of the ways we could get better at acknowledging disenfranchised grief, that added layer on top of what is already such a tough lived experience, is increasing awareness. And this looks like promoting understanding of what actually disenfranchised grief is in all of its various forms and how it impacts multiple individuals, families, and communities. And by doing this, we can help to reduce the misconceptions and stigma surrounding different types of losses.
Yeah. I just want to interject, Dr. Dani, if that's all right, because I just want to make sure that the listeners know, like when we ask this question, because people ask in therapy sessions all of the time, like, well, as a society, as an individual, like, how can I better support people who experience this disenfranchised grief or, something that occurs for many on a daily basis? And so thinking about like those intersections of identities, like what can you do differently? So increasing awareness is significant, right? That it's the education piece is huge. What next kind of in your research did you find?
Well, I'd love to just tag onto that just very quickly, like what can you do, really stepping into our personal autonomy, right? What can we do so that we are feeling less disenfranchised? We are feeling less unable to lean in and help. Now, again, I'd like to say this similarly. I want to say that I recognize that there's a lot of other things that come into play, whether or not you can actually step into and do some of these things. I'm only saying, I love that you pointed out, what can you do? What can you do in ways that are safe enough for you based on who you are and what your needs are, right?
Yes.
So increased awareness was the first one, right? wonderfully put, and thank you for bringing in some more context there. The next one would be, which went beautifully with increasing our awareness, is fostering communication. I think I mentioned earlier that language is just so important, and how we communicate is a game changer in all cases. So, encouraging open conversations with coming from a place of loving kindness about loss, and creating inclusive and supportive spaces for people to share their experiences without fear and judgment. And so I'd like to say that sounds great on its face, right? But also creating supportive spaces for like others, meaning creating multiple supportive spaces for people to be able to be in community with folks like themselves, so that there is that connection and that shorthand I've talked about, but also it allows people to hopefully feel encouraged to step in and speaking their truth when they're in spaces with like others. Practicing empathy and validation, so acknowledging that all grief is valid regardless of societal norms or perceived significance of loss. Listening without judgment, huge. We could all do that in all cases of communication with folks. Validating people's emotions, and believing what people tell you about their profound sorrow. So here it is again, talking about this belief piece. I can't tell you how many times we filter things through our own lived experience, and because that's not our experience, how can that be true for someone else? And our job is to, as humans, we do that. We're going to filter things through our own lived experience. And we have to make space for this other piece, which is this person's telling me this is their experience. And even though I may not understand that, my job is to believe them and respect their position.
Yeah.
Another one that is really tough, and this is for people who have the emotional energy and feel comfortable enough to step into this part of the work, which is challenging emotion phobia and grief illiteracy. That looks like debunking outdated societal expectations of perfectionism and productivity regarding grief, and promoting realistic and fluid timeframes for meaning making, continuing bonds, adapting, and integrating significant loss across the lifespan. So, any type of loss across the lifespan. And any of us who are a little bit longer in the tooth, that would be me. I can tell you, there are a lot of losses across the lifespan that in North American societies, we do not touch on. I mean, you listed off a bunch of stuff that was amazing. There's so many things that we just don't acknowledge around loss across the lifespan. So important. And then establishing resources. So again, talking again about communal opportunities, creating communities with individuals who can share their experiences with other folks who get them and understand them. And maybe it's based on the specific type of loss event that you've experienced, or maybe it's based on being part of a community that has a baseline of disenfranchisement that runs really deep. So, how can you be with those folks and work on finding ways to support each other as you navigate that? And then finally, encouraging support, promoting access to therapeutic services that utilize updated loss and grief models that foster the fluid, non-pathologizing time frames or windows of grief, and culturally sensitive supports that include inclusive rituals to accommodate various types of losses in meaningful ways. And so this is just a start. It's a lot, right? And so with anything, for change to occur, small steps. So if any of the listeners are hearing things that maybe you're already doing, but you've come up with some additional ideas where you could expand in doing some of this work, or if some of the listeners are listening and they're feeling motivated by one of the things that we've talked about, great. That's awesome. hopefully it will provide the impetus for people to continue to try to work on destigmatizing loss, and in particular disenfranchised loss experiences. So if we can get more folks to consider implementing these strategies, society can create a more supportive and inclusive environment for those experiencing disenfranchised grief, ultimately promoting healthier grieving processes and eventually emotional well-being, which everyone deserves to experience. And I want to acknowledge that that is not true for folks who live in a world where marginalized identities constantly experience loss, and those losses are profoundly disenfranchised. So, that said, I'm curious if there are any typical exercises or activities, Dr. Leah Merle, that you use when with clients who are not just navigating profound losses, but also dealing with the added layer of feeling unseen, unvalidated, or disenfranchised by the complexity of their losses.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we could talk on all day on and how we practice regarding treatment and implementation. But specifically for this population, I would say, I mean, one of my favorite in with this population is a grief timeline. It's something that I learned in grad school. It's something that I've used from a creative arts perspective with you and I when we've taught classes together. I just find that so profound for folks where they are able to kind of put their life on a timeline almost from beginning of their life to where they are now, and then put on that timeline certain losses that have had an impact on them, and what do those losses look like. And I've done this in teaching and as a professor in grad school too, with folks who are going through their training. And when they do that timeline and they think about the disenfranchised losses that they've experienced, right? Like I remember being in grad school and realizing how many times after a certain age, within a certain period of time, that I'd moved house, right? So I had, that was those experiences were a loss for me, right? And I internalized that in a certain way. So the grid timeline, I could go on about how productive that can be, and it's adaptive, dependent on the individual. That's definitely one. You know how I love guided imagery and mindfulness-based activities, building the toolkit for folks to be able to pull out of their toolkit what works for them. I love somatic-oriented exercises as well. I think that anything that we can kind of help a client with when they're experiencing anything, but specifically loss with that grief process, is the body-based connection, connecting mind and body. Because obviously when we go through a loss, the prefrontal cortex is not always online, and we want to try and bring that prefrontal cortex back online, and help people integrate their experience, which is what you've been talking about. So those are a few that I would say. And the five senses, I think that's one that I work with a lot with this population. But I'll pass it back to you. What about you?
Yeah, so many things as well. I agree with you. The loss and grief timeline is such a profound experience for folks to be able to, really take a look at not just obvious or what we perceived as significant losses, but again, tying back to the secondary and tertiary losses that were byproducts of those experiences and how that also impacted us, right? And then being able to see also within that, what is obscured? What was obscured by this loss because this thing had to happen? Or what was a loss that occurred, but it was so ambiguous, you hadn't even really thought of it in that way.
Yeah.
Or all the primary, secondary, tertiary losses that were so huge, and the aspects of being able to grieve them that were disenfranchised, right? So I love, love, love that exercise. 1000%. Thank you for bringing that in. I would also say that working with folks around moving their body in whatever way works best for them, especially in the beginning months of grief, What would it look like to be able to just take some short walks? If you're at a place where the weather is conducive, outside. If not, even if it's just around wherever you're at and inside, maybe 10 minutes or so. Also, some stretching, simple stretching. There are a lot of YouTube videos and movement apps that folks can, for free, that people can use to help them move their body.
It doesn't have to be like training for a marathon or running, right? Running constantly. It can be stretching. It can be walking for 10 minutes.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Another thing that I love is, I'm loving a lot of things right now as we're talking about this. Listening to meditations or sounds, whether it's sound baths or whether it's different frequencies of sound that helps either calm our nervous system, helps us to invigorate our nervous system. Same thing with sound baths as well, using sound bowls, right? All of that, the concept of how that works with our brain and body, helping to ground and settle our systems. And then finally, creativity. One of my mottos is, let's create something, let's create with intention, let's create a collage, let's create time to bake your favorite thing. Let's create time to learn how to crochet or draw. Collaging, did I say that already? Collaging is really, really something that can be, for folks who feel that they're not artistic or they're not into art. Collaging is very user friendly and actually quite satisfying to look for images that feel supportive to you and just get those down on a piece of paper. I'm talking like, half of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, or doing it online. There are, I think it's iSplash. There are so many online sources for imagery, pictures that are free. And sometimes when I'm working with grieving folks, we create it online together. So there's lots of ways of collaging. And then, of course, I do talk with folks a lot about free writing, just quickly jotting down what is coming up for you after that guided meditation, what's coming up for you after you created that imagery of, resourcing and supports that feel helpful to you. Just writing that down. And what that does is when we work creatively in all the ways that Leah and I were just talking about, if you can do whatever that creative process is, which would be more like, if I bring it into grieving styles, more like in that heart space, right? If you're doing that sort of work, we want to then move along that continuum over to what would be that instrumental headspace where we do some free writing. We don't worry about spelling. We don't worry about what we're actually saying. No one's going to read this. It's just an opportunity to get this out of your brain so that you get it down in writing. And what that does is another layer of integration. It's not just externalizing and getting it out, but it's also concretizing what it is that we wanted to get out of us. So, such a great way to work and can be done pretty simply with minimal tools.
Yeah.
I think I covered everything. Oh, I did mention the apps, and there are two apps I just want to name while we're talking. Insight Timer, great app. There are so many things that folks have access to that are free. They have meditations on grief expressions, grief compassion, writing the ways of grief, the alchemy of grief, healing meditation for grieving animal loss, grief regarding racism, trauma healing. They also have a couple of interviews with Frances Weller and with Joanne Cacciatore, Bearing the Unbearable. So all of that is free. I really encourage folks to consider downloading that app if you don't already use it. And the other one is Calm. Calm also, both of those apps have pay portions you can do, but they also offer some really beautiful resources that are free. And then, of course, podcasts, listen to other podcasts and the books that we've already offered in the previous episodes.
Yes.
So that's about it.
Fantastic resources. And if listeners are not quite sure where to go and get the applications, you just go to your mobile device. And as Dani shared, they are free. You just go to wherever your store is that you can download those devices, and you can download it free, or you can pay the subscription as well. One other thing that I wanted to mention is about the free write exercise. And I mean, I have learned to love writing, but the fact is that that is such a great tool for a lot of different things. And it means it's activating, right? When you're writing, not typing on a computer, but when you're actually writing and free writing, it's activating both parts of the brain, just like when you're walking, just like when you're running or swimming, we're actually activating both parts of the brain. So it really helps integration. So that is a really fantastic one. So
Yes, we're literally mimicking moving from that instrumental grieving headspace to that intuitive grieving heart space. We're actually engaging in that actual process.
love it. I love it. And as Dani said, we have resources, all of those resources in the description of the podcast episode. So please go through those. Let us know what's helpful. Let us know what wasn't helpful. It's definitely great to have some feedback. So thank you, listeners, as always, for joining us in this final chapter of What is Grief in an Emotionally Avoidant Culture. So that was part 1, part 2, and this is our final part 3. And a real special thanks. Go ahead.
Oh, and I just want to say, because I didn't do my official sign off tagline.
Yeah.
As we wrap up today, it's so important. Please remember that anything that I have to offer, only take what resonates for you and your lived experience and leave the rest behind. I do not know everything. As I've said before, I have been taught so many amazingly beautiful life lessons from incredible, healthy grievers. And I appreciate the opportunity to pass that along to folks. Just know that take what works best for you and leave the rest behind.
Oh, what a beautiful note to kind of finalize and bring to a culmination. I hope you know that I've used that a lot with folks that I work with, and I learned it from you, learned it from the best, of course, is take what resonates and leave the rest behind, right?
Well, I love that you say that. And again, I said in part 1, I stole this. Well, I borrowed it from my mentor and dear friend and colleague, Catherine McCormick. And so it is such a gift to be able to pass that along, and so freeing to know that people don't have to take anything I have to offer. And I am so fine with that.
Yeah, well said, Dr. Dani Baker. But really, a special thanks. This has been a phenomenal experience for me to really just talk with you about the grief process. And thanks for, as always, for your beautiful insight, dedication, and expertise. But specifically to this population, Dana, you just have a natural gift for helping others, but particularly navigating through grief and the complexity and the multiple faceted layers of grief. So thank you for being here.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And coming soon, look for my Instagram at the Creative Works Co. Where I'm going to be daily offerings and different resources for supporting yourself as you're navigating life, grief, and anything else in between. So look for that in the next week or so, and hopefully you'll find that to be some additional resources that'll help folks.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks for letting me plug. Thanks for letting me plug.
Of course, dear, to Dani, of course. But also for you, for the listeners, if today's discussion resonated with you, or if you're specifically seeking resources, then Dani has done a really great job of building a resource list, and we've included those helpful links and recommendations in the actual episode notes, like I stated before. And then I will put in Dr. Dani's Instagram and how you can reach out to her and how you can reach out to me also if you have any specific questions. But also don't forget to share this episode with somebody that you think might benefit from these insights. It's really important to kind of share the information as well. So until next time, I am, as you know, Dr. Leah Merle. Please stay curious, compassionate, non-judgmental, and really open to growth as we continue to explore the many, many facets of the human experience on Tea with the Experts. And Dr. Leah Merle, please do not forget to subscribe. Thank you so much, and I will talk to you next time. Bye for now.